All right. Well, in an effort to respect everyone's time, including Kristen's time, and I know she has so much great information to pack in such a short period of time, it is 2:02 Eastern Standard Time for Kristen and I, and we want to dive right in to today's session, the Great Resignation, finding, engaging, and keeping talent in a post-COVID economy. I tell you, there cannot be a better topic given our current environment. So we are thrilled to have Kristen. My name is Stephanie Anderson, and I am a member of Grace Hill. I will be doing our back end today while we allow Kristen to present all of her great information. So if anyone needs me, I will be in the chat box. As I mentioned a few moments ago, today's session will be recorded and sent out to all registered attendees later this week. And so we hope you will stay throughout the longevity today, but we do know in property management, things can get slightly busy. And if you do have to hop off, you can certainly catch the replay later. Now, I am thrilled to have Kristen Magni here, Managing Partner, Advisory Services. You may know her name, and hopefully you do. And if not, I want to tell you just a little bit about her. Kristen has actually been a consultant that we have worked with at Grace Hill and just been a phenomenal industry professional who is always talking about a lot of the hot topics in the industry. She has been an expert for over 20 years, with the last 16 being right here in the real estate industry. And so she is going to bring a wealth of knowledge to today's conversation. And I hope you will engage with her, not just throughout today's presentation in the chat, but also during the live Q&A that we'll do towards the end of today's presentation. Now, today during this webinar, Kristen is going to discuss the shifting needs and expectation of today's workforce and what organizations need to be focused on to attract, engage, and retain the next generation of leaders. And I don't know about you all, but this is definitely something you will be able to take some nuggets away from to apply to your organization. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to present to you Kristen Magni.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. It is great to be here with all of you today. And if you noticed, I made a little adjustment to the name of the discussion today. We're here to talk about the Great Resignation, but it's such a lagging indicator. And it's such an interesting word. So the word resign and the word resign are spelled exactly the same and have two completely different meanings. And what we really need to be doing is getting people to resign, not to resign. So I'd rather think of the discussion today as us thinking about what we need to do in order to have a great resign-nation versus a great resignation. So this will be forward-looking. Hopefully, I'm going to give you a few nuggets in terms of some research that's been done, even some of the things that we found in our employee engagement survey program in terms of insights and data around the evolving drivers of retention in the workplace. They are changing, but I really want this to be forward thinking. So with the exception of this first part, once we get past this first part of reflections, from there on, it'll be forward thinking, some things that we can be doing or thinking about as we plan strategically for some change management, most likely over the coming year. So I want to start out, I have a couple of polls, and I always like to start these conversations by getting a better understanding of how you're entering the conversation. So we actually have 4 questions here. And if you could just take a minute to answer these questions, what I'm really asking you to do is think about what's been on your own mind as an individual over the past 12 to 18 months. So I'm curious if you've spent more time than in previous years evaluating your personal priorities, what's important to you personally and both professionally. The second question is, over the past 18 months, have you paid closer attention to how organizations navigate crisis due to COVID, certainly due to some of the social issues that we've had in our nation over the last year to year and a half? Have you thought about your stability and the certainty of your future more than maybe you have in past years? And the last question is, over the past year, have you entertained, and these polls are anonymous, have you entertained the possibility of opportunities outside your current organization or leaving the workforce entirely? So we'll give you a minute to answer those questions. And Stephanie, I will lean on you to decide when the best time to show those results are.
Let's give it about 15 more seconds. Get those last minute votes in. We have about 80% of attendees who have voted so far. So
great. Yeah, no right or wrong answers.
All right, so let's go ahead and close this out.
All right, so as I suspected, at least on the first three questions, I fully anticipated that most people would say strongly agree or agree. And we actually have that on all three of those initial questions. I anticipated having some mixed results on the last question, but interestingly, we've got 62% of people who have said that they have entertained the possibility of opportunities outside of their current organization or leaving the workforce entirely. So what's interesting about that is I'm going to assume that we probably have a lot of people who are in this webinar today that are either responsible for hiring or are people managers. And the reason I'm asking these questions is because if you've been thinking about these things, then why wouldn't everybody else be thinking about these things? And one of the things that we're going to be talking about, I have a couple of facts that I'm going to share, is that oftentimes executives, especially in this industry, and actually it's not necessarily just in this industry, are somewhat disconnected from the front line. Executives tend to have other priorities and are thinking of things much more strategically, working on different things. And sometimes we forget to look back. We forget what it was like to be in our first job out of college, or we forget what it was like to be trying to balance a young family and maybe our first promotion. So one of the things that we will also talk about today is getting reconnected and understanding that many of the things that you're thinking about as leaders in your organization are probably amplified for the people who are not leaders in your organization because their financial situations and potentially family situations might be a little bit different. So I want to start out with something that I don't know if we always are thinking about, but we definitely are always thinking about that it's all about the ROI. And if you were to think about your square footage of space and what you tend to spend money on a day-to-day basis, I think more often than not, you're going to find that people are where you spend the most of your dollars. Okay, and you can calculate that out by square foot. You can look at the other things that you invest in, whether it's business intelligence or whether it's your financial costs or whether it's your environmental initiatives or technology initiatives. And almost always, the cost of your people is going to be where the majority of your spend is. So people retention, well-being, productivity, training, all of those things cost a lot of money. And you're making a big investment in people. So developing and retaining them is by far your greatest ROI. The cost of turnover. So I'm not sure in your organizations if you, on an annual basis, take a look at your turnover and actually do a calculation of what that costs. Depending on how many people are in your organization, it can cost millions of dollars. when you lose people. So here we have the cost of losing an employee can range from tens of thousands of dollars to twice their annual salary. And these costs include hiring, onboarding, training, ramp time, lower engagement, more errors due to lower engagement, and general culture impact. So sometimes when we think about turnover, we just think about those salaries, but there's a lot of soft costs involved in both hiring, retaining, and developing people. So when we think about the cost of turnover, we have to think about all of those things, including lower productivity if people aren't as engaged. So I like to think of employees as appreciating assets that produce more value to organizations over time, which explains why losing them is so costly. And here we have some data, a really good graphic from Burson by Deloitte. And if you look at this graph, we have two zones that we can think about when it comes to people. One is the investment zone, and that is the organization is investing in you. So that's when you're a new hire, that's your onboarding. And as a matter of fact, most of your costs are front loaded when we think about workman's comp and some of the other taxes and things that organizations incur during the first 12 months of someone's employment. So that's really the investment zone. And then we invest additional time and money into training. And so there needs to be a certain amount of time that someone's in the organization before we hit this return zone. And that's the organization is benefiting from you. So what impacts that? Well, there's a couple of things that impact that return zone, that return on investment for you as an employer. One of them is employee engagement, recognition, development, great management, and those activities or behaviors will yield discretionary effort from high engagement. Another thing that we have to think about, and I think of the property management, the real estate business as a service business. For the most part, what we're not in the space business, we're in the service business and the people business, very much hospitality focused. But as much as we've been automated and digitized and things in our life have become technical, we are very much a service economy. And as a matter of fact, right now, we're seeing this happening. There's 10 million people who have disappeared from the workforce. We don't know where they are, but we know that the majority of those individuals have been in service type roles. And this is affecting the real estate industry as well, multifamily and commercial real estate. We're seeing airlines having to cancel flights, restaurants closing, retail is being hit, and so is our industry. So the service economy is now the center of the economy, despite huge tech growth, and service makes or breaks the customer experience. So in a recurring revenue business, which is what we are in, losing customers is bad. That's kind of obvious. But losing customers and employees, that is a brand disaster. So our economic center has shifted. When more and more of our consumer life is digitized, the non-digital part becomes more important than ever. And employers need to spend more time and, unfortunately, more money on service teams, service organization, and service workers. But remember, your ROI is coming from your people. And because that tends to be on your budget lines, the biggest number, that's usually where we go to first when it comes to budget cuts. So that's something that we have to be really thinking about. And you might be asking yourself, how do we get here? Wasn't digital transformation supposed to make everything self-service so we don't need as many people? Well, despite huge growth in tech, the opposite has actually happened. So while we've automated so many things in our life, we're doing Zoom meetings, we have information services galore. Right now, at this point, we are clamoring for human contact. When we call, we have an issue with our service, or we have an issue with our credit card or a utility, and we can't get a hold of a person. It's more frustrating than it ever has been. And we're seeing a lot of that because of staff shortages. So we are very much right smack in the middle of a service economy. I'm going to play a little video for you to set the stage on what I'm going to talk about next. This is Simon Sinek. This was actually recorded right before the pandemic, but I'm going to build off of it as soon as we listen to him talk about a gentleman that he met by the name of Noah.
I'll tell you a true story. A few months ago, I stayed at the Four Seasons in Las Vegas. It is a wonderful hotel. And the reason it's a wonderful hotel is not because of the fancy beds. Any hotel can go and buy a fancy bed. The reason it's a wonderful hotel is because of the people who work there. If you walk past somebody at the Four Seasons and they say hello to you, you get the feeling that they actually wanted to say hello to you. It's not that somebody told them that you have to say hello to all the customers, say hello to all the guests, right? You actually feel that they care. Now, in their lobby, they have a coffee stand. And one afternoon, I went to buy a cup of coffee, and there was a barista by the name of Noah who was serving me. Noah was fantastic. He was friendly and fun, and he was engaging with me, and I had so much fun buying a cup of coffee, I actually think I gave 100% tip, right? He was wonderful. So as is my nature, I asked Noah, do you like your job? And without skipping a beat, Noah says, I love my job. And so I followed up. I said, what is it that the Four Seasons is doing that would make you say to me, I love my job? And without skipping a beat, Noah said, throughout the day, managers will walk past me and ask me how I'm doing, if there's anything that I need to do my job better. He said, not just my manager, any manager. And then he said something magical. He says, I also work at Caesar's Palace. And at Caesar's Palace, the managers are trying to make sure we're doing everything right. They catch us when we do things wrong. He says, when I go to work there, I like to keep my head under the radar and just get through the day so I can get my paycheck. He says, here at the Four Seasons, I feel I can be myself. Same person, entirely a different experience from the customer who will engage with Noah. So we in leadership are always criticizing the people. We're always saying, we got to get the right people on the bus. I've got to fill my team. I got to get the right people. But the reality is, it's not the people. It's the leadership. If we create the right environment, we will get people like Noah at the Four Seasons. If we create the wrong environment, we will get people like Noah at Caesar's Palace. I'll tell you.
So interesting to opine on what we just heard. Same person, two completely different experiences as an employee, two completely different experiences for the customer based on the employee's environment. So I like to talk about ecosystems a lot, put the people to the side, because the people don't matter as much if the ecosystem isn't conducive to people thriving. So some of the research that we've done through the Grace Hill Kingsley Keep program, which is our employee engagement survey, is pointing to the fact that the drivers of retention are changing a little bit. Now, like I said, the story about Noah was recorded right before the pandemic, right before all of the issues that we've had around equity and racial equity in this country. And so layer on top of that story what's happened over the past 12 to 18 months. Remember how you answered the polls that we started the session today with. And the four drivers of retention, why employees stay, is what we have here. So one of them being well-being, another being inclusion, another being company culture, and another being manager effectiveness. So manager effectiveness, we used to say, you've probably heard people quit their manager, they don't quit their job. The relationship between the manager and the employee. But manager effectiveness is actually a little bit different, because a lot of the environments that we're working in today are decentralized. People are working in more flexible types of environments. They're trying to juggle other things outside of work. So we have very much a collision of work and personal life. We have other things going on in our communities that are impacting our mental health. So the manager's job has become much more complicated. And there's a lot riding on the manager to ensure that certain things about the conditions in the workplace are effective so that outcomes can be achieved. In the property management industry, we tend to be very activity driven. That needs to shift. We need to shift from seeing people and seeing their activity to being hyper focused on what outcomes we're trying to achieve. And that's really manager effectiveness. So setting clear expectations, providing feedback, sharing an interest in someone's mobility in the organization. That goes further beyond just the relationship between the employee and the manager. So these are the 4 drivers of retention that we're really starting to see in our trends. So 3 facts that I'm going to talk about here now, given all of this, that from the industry, and it's not just the real estate industry, we see this in a lot of industries, but the property management industry in particular has been historically challenged with its employer value proposition. So we used to say when I was in the industry, nobody necessarily goes to school to be a property manager or never even thinks about working in the apartment industry necessarily. We're not going into high schools and talking to people about the industry in the way some of our competitor industries are doing. So we're all competing for the same talent when it comes to a service economy. There's a lot of different directions that people can go. The property management industry has also been challenged with its talent development strategies. So it's great that Grace Hill has a wonderful suite of training and development products. But for many organizations, offering things above and beyond, particularly when it comes to leadership development, not just getting people into those first line leader roles, but also developing your operational leaders to move into positions that need to be more strategic. So getting someone from that general manager position into that more regional role or even into that executive role is a completely different skill set where you're really focused on driving the behavior and outcomes of teams versus doing the work. So that's a big shift in responsibility and competencies. For organizations that are third party, that becomes more difficult because it's the client that has to pay for that. So the value proposition of investing in people then becomes the client's issue. And that can be really hard to sell sometimes. Fact number 2, executives, and I mentioned this a little earlier, and this is not to be negative or critical necessarily, but executives are often disconnected from who matters the most and what's important to them. Who matters the most is the front line. And so in my conversations with executives, and I say, well, do you know who your top salesperson is? Or do you know who the accountant is that always gets the numbers right and always has their financial packages done on time? Do you know the person who is protecting the shield from hackers and whatever else getting into your data? So not often do people who are in the highest levels of leadership know who's on their front line. And I would say that's relatively normal. And the analogy I usually say is, think about a horse race. Folks who are in the C-suite have essentially won the race. So when you think about climbing the corporate ladder or advancing in your career, once you're in that very high-level executive role, there's not too many steps for you to go from there. But when we get to that point, we often don't take time to look back. So it's like the horse that wins the race doesn't look back to see where the other horses are. So we actually have to be intentional about looking back and remembering what it was like to be that kid out of college, to be that person who is really trying to understand what they need to do to get promoted, to be that person who wants to get from that general manager role into that regional role. We're sometimes disconnected from what those needs are and the challenges that are associated with the individual groups who are in those roles. And then the third fact is that corporate identity and company culture are no longer defined by the physical workplace. And that is a reality that is happening with the shift in hybrid work, the work from home, the need to work from home. For many organizations, culture is about being in a place. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about shifting some thinking about how we develop company culture in some different ways. So why is this important? Well, let's go to fact number one here. So the property management industry has been historically challenged with its employer value proposition and talent development strategies. So I have a client that I'm working with right now where we are looking at reimagining some of their roles in their residential division, and also how they show up online. And what's interesting, so I live here in the DC metro area, and I was looking at some of their job descriptions to try to see, you know, the job ads, what's drawing people in. And there was, the job advertisements were fine. They explained what the person would be doing on a day-to-day basis. But guess what? Within the last 14 days, there were 300 additional positions open in the DC metro area for the exact same job. So what's the value proposition? If I'm going to come and work in the industry, and I can also go work in hospitality, and I can also go work in retail, why should I come and work for you? So that employer value proposition, what makes you special as a place, needs to be communicated both internally and externally. And then we have those talent development strategies as well. So I gave you why they stay. Some of the reasons why they quit have to do with three things. So company culture was one of our drivers of retention. And you could roll well-being and inclusion into company culture because that's all about the ecosystem. Compensation is another one. So the reality is that in the real estate industry, things have been the same for a very long time. The way people are compensated has not changed. Bonus plans and structures are highly dependent on what other people are doing in the industry. Well, what I'm going to suggest is that we need to rethink, at least in the short term, our compensation strategies. Because when we also look at the importance of equity in our work environments, you have people who are on the front line who need to be at work 7 days a week, 365 days a year, because they're in public facing positions, and they are often paid the least amount of money and have to show up 100% of the time. And they're looking around at the rest of the organization saying, well, why do those folks get to work from home? And they get paid more than me. And I'm not going to go work for them. I'm not going to do it. And that's why we have such a shortage of people who are willing to come into the industry. So I'm going to suggest we need to start thinking about compensation, and there might be some trade-offs for flexibility. We may have to pay those frontline workers a premium because they have to be there all the time. And the trade-off for that is flexibility. It's a complete shift in thinking about how we compensate people. The other reason that people quit is stagnating for long periods of time in the same job. And so what I want to show you here is, this is some information, some data from Glassdoor that is actually pointing to the fact that when people leave their jobs, it's most often because they're looking for mobility. And so we have 73%, according to Glassdoor, of people who left their employer because they wanted to change roles. So going back to those talent development strategies and thinking about ROI and investing in people where that return zone is, thinking about how we get people from point A to point B to point C is fundamentally important. And it's not fundamentally important from a subjective standpoint. It's something that people need to know when they come into the organization. Another thing that I have not seen organizations do a great job of is providing a roadmap for people. And to be honest, when we think about our millennial and soon to be Gen Z folks coming into the workplace, that's their experience up until they get into into their career. So I have a son who's in college. On day one, when he starts his semester, he gets his roadmap. He knows what he's supposed to do, when he's supposed to do it, how he's supposed to do it. And if he does those things, the end result should be good. So he's accustomed to having a lot of information at his fingertips. He's accustomed to being able to access things, even if those things don't necessarily impact him today. He still wants access to that information. Very focused on how he gets from point A to point B. So what's happening is kids are coming out of school, they're coming into the workplace, and that goes away. And they don't do well with the ambiguity, and they don't have the patience for not feeling like they have access to information. So we're seeing people primarily leave when they are in search of upward mobility because it's either not available to them in their current organization or they don't know how to get there. There's a big difference between being ambitious and being ready. And oftentimes, in an absence of clarity around how one gets from point A to point B, me being an ambitious professional, I'm going to say, well, I'm ambitious, so that means I'm ready. And nobody's actually explained to me what ready means in other terms, so I'm going to get frustrated. And that's what we see happening a lot of the time. So a little bit of a change in mindsets in terms of how we think about talent. And I'm a big proponent of linking talent to value. And when we link talent to value, we then also link executives to those key people in the organization who are contributing and providing value. I'm not suggesting that not everyone provides some sort of value, but there are three distinct categories when we start thinking about linking talent to value. The first one is value creators. And so value creators, they generate revenue. They lower operating costs and they increase capital efficiency. So your value creators might be your leasing folks. They're going to be your business development people. They might be folks who are in a development capacity. They're doing deals, they're making money for the company, value creators. Then you have value enablers. And so value enablers, they perform indispensable support function work that enables creators. So value enablers are like your training folks, your HR folks, your recruiting folks. Those are the folks that are enabling the value creators to be successful. Oftentimes in organizations, when your value creators are not performing or are not achieving the outcomes that one would like them to achieve, organizations or leaders will fall back on the value enablers. We have the wrong person. We need to send them to a training class. But really, that's not the role of those support functions. They're there to really create those programs and to create those processes so that the people who lead value creators can help to make sure that they're successful. So those are your value enablers. And then value protectors. Value protectors, they protect the fort. Your maintenance folks, your accounting folks, your cybersecurity or technology folks. So when you start to think about who are the individuals in your organization and in what ways do they create value for your organization, you can start to think differently about the outcomes that you might have with your people. So roles that drive or enable value can be found across the organization. And the traditional approach is very hierarchical. So a hierarchy heavily influences which roles are viewed as most important. Sometimes we even see, I've seen org charts where all you see are the names of the people who are at the top of the hierarchy, and then everybody else is sort of categorized by a role. So within a hierarchical level, roles are assigned a similar level of importance. And I'm going to suggest we kind of flip that a little bit and think about the talent to value approach. So in the talent to value approach, role importance is linked to an explicit perspective on value that can be created or enabled by a role. So not all roles in the same hierarchical level are assigned the same importance. So you can sit down with your talent profiles or with your org chart and start to think a little bit differently about linking an explicit perspective on value that can be created or enabled by a role. So it's a complete shift in how you look at the importance or the value of people in your organization. So fact number 2, executives are often disconnected from who matters the most and what is important to them. So this is called the SCARF model. It's from the Neuro Leadership Institute. And I like to use this because this is the neuroscience of motivation. So when we think about people, there are certain things as human beings that just biologically is always on our mind. And you might see yourself in this model. The S stands for status. So as humans, we're always looking at the relative importance of people. I'm valuable. And so as a leader, what do you need to do? You need to ensure that people know that they're valued. The C stands for certainty. So we don't like to not know what's going to happen next. So when we think about our future, you answered the poll at the beginning of the question, or at the beginning of this session, thinking about your future and your future stability. We like to be able to predict the future to some extent. How certain are we? Do I know where I stand or what is going to happen next? So as a leader, what can you do? You can do a better job of making sure it's very clear where someone stands and what's going to happen. The A stands for autonomy. So it looks at our perception of having control over our environment. I have a choice. I want to own the things that I'm responsible for. So how can we provide people with some degree of input and choice? The R stands for relatedness. So it looks at our relationships and sense of fitting in. As a leader, how can I make people feel part of a team, create a sense of belonging? And then fairness. So this is looking at our perception of being treated fairly for you and for others. From a leader's perspective, taking everything together, am I treating people fairly, whether they're on my team or whether they're not on my team? So these are constantly going on in our minds. If you're doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work, this should resonate as well, because this is the equity and inclusion conversation. So these are some of the things that we need to be thinking about in terms of what people have on their minds. And this is universal. It doesn't matter where you come from or what role you're in. This is a sort of like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs when it comes to motivation. And then, of course, trust in leadership is another key factor. And trust is not a given. Trust is built over time. And so in the workplace, healthy, inclusive relationships are built on a foundation of equality and trust. And in order to have trust, we have to be working on other things. So those ecosystems really need to be in check. So today's employees, they are seeking a couple of things: belonging, inspiration, growth. So the ability to grow within an organization is most widely chosen as impacting employee experience. And this is coming from some research done by the HR Research Institute. And that's followed by trust in leaders, compensation and benefits. That needs to be reimagined. And of course, that positive culture. And when we look again at positive culture, we're thinking about inclusion and well-being rolling up under that as well. So what is culture? Anthropologists define culture as an attachment to place. So culture is created by an attachment to place. And I like to apply that definition to the workplace, because what that means is the concept of place is both physical as well as psychological. And if any of you on the call today have studied urban planning or have worked with urban planners, there's a very specific template that urban planners use when they think about activating public spaces. And you can see an example of that here. And what I'm going to encourage you to do is that when you're thinking about how does your company culture evolve, that you apply placemaking theory to it. Leaders need to become placemakers, managing the conditions and creating an environment that inspires exceptional performance. Culture is created by attachment to place. So when we think about the anatomy of an engaged employee, it's a lot of different things that we need to be thinking about. And I created this just like it's the anatomy of a person, but we're looking at feedback, recognition, communication. Communication is much more than top down and across. Communication is even, the type of feedback that I'm getting, that roadmap that helps me navigate my career path, understanding what's going on around me. So communication comes in various forms at various times and through different channels. So the heart, people are purpose driven. So our millennials were really our first sort of purpose driven, digitally integrated generation. Gen Z is going to be millennials on steroids. So Gen Z is all of the millennial stuff. They will be the first socially responsible generation. And that's not just socially responsible as it relates to the environment, that will be socially responsible as it relates to people as well. They will be the most diverse generation coming into the workforce and the most digitally integrated and the most socially responsible. So then we have alignment. So these are the ongoing supervisor conversations, ensuring individual and team goals, support achieving the company's top priorities, career development, and performance management. So performance management improves workplace relationships and trust and ensures alignment around the organization's top priorities. I don't mean the system. That's just where you go and you document things. I mean the actual performance philosophy. How does everyone in the organization contribute to the organization's top priorities? So fact number 3, corporate identity and company culture are no longer defined by the physical workplace. So we've talked about that a little bit, but if you just think about a person, and particularly over the last year or so, think about a person or place to which you feel a strong sense of attachment or loyalty. Why do you feel this way? What is it that they do that causes and reinforces that attachment? So just want you to think about this for a second. Think about a person or place to which you feel a strong sense of attachment or loyalty. Why do you feel this way? What do they, or what does it do that causes and reinforces that attachment? So is it necessarily a physical place? I'm probably going to guess that it's not. So let's go back to placemaking. Placemaking is the process of creating quality places where people want to live, work, play, and learn. Fundamental to urban planning, fundamental to activating spaces. And so as leaders, we can become placemakers, not managers. All right. So we're not managing people. We are creating conditions and activating environments so that people can thrive. Same concept. Quality placemaking results in environments that are safe, connected, welcoming, conducive to authentic experiences, accessible, so people have the tools, resources, and support needed to thrive, comfortable. They have personality and nurture a sense of belonging. They're sociable, so they have a fabric that encourages people to connect with each other. That doesn't necessarily have to be face-to-face. So thinking about ways to be sociable in virtual environments, we're doing that today. And then able to promote and facilitate engagement. There's other components of placemaking as it relates to urban planning. But when we think about the fundamentals of placemaking, there's absolutely no reason why we can't take those same theories and apply it to our workplace. The same theories that we apply to activating public spaces, where we want diverse people to come and to feel like they belong and to engage in the environment. Isn't that exactly what we're doing in the workplace? We don't often think of it in terms of placemaking and that ecosystem. So from quit to commit, here we get back to the Great Resign. That's what we want people to do. We want them to commit. What impacts and hinders employee experiences? So we've talked about some of this, but the ability to grow within the organization, trust in leaders, good compensation and benefits. We've got company culture in there. So under company culture, we're thinking about well-being and inclusion. Well-being is very, very important to our new generation of people coming into the workplace. Factors that hinder organizations from enhancing the employee experience. Well, budget constraints, more important priorities, and insufficient buy-in from senior managers. So now hopefully after today, if you are a senior manager, you can start to think about some of these things. But if you need to go to a senior manager and make a business case, you'll have some good nuggets to go ahead and do that. So how can organizations improve employee experiences? Well, we've talked about why they stay. We've talked about some of the reasons why they quit. So learning and development, making sure people have upward mobility. Even in society in general, when we are thinking about the equity conversation, oftentimes it's about upward mobility. Generally speaking, that's what people want. So that learning and development, that career pathing is fundamentally important to keeping people engaged. Mentoring and coaching. So on the job training, being able to see someone who is doing the job, take some things off their plate, have a coach becomes really important in keeping people engaged. And then recognition programs. So recognition programs don't have to be complicated. I'll encourage you to ask yourself the question, when do you feel appreciated? What makes you feel appreciated? I ask this question a lot, and almost probably 80% of the time, the answer I get include two things. I feel appreciated when I feel heard. I want people to ask me for my opinion. I want people to value my ideas. The other thing that I often hear is I want to be thanked. I just want to get an attaboy or an attagirl or an atta them, just someone to acknowledge that I'm doing my best. Wonderful thing about that type of recognition program, it is absolutely free. But it takes discipline and it takes consistency. And again, pulling the equity conversation into that discussion, it has to happen consistently across the enterprise. And then manager and leadership development. So obviously getting those folks ready for their next step so that when they become leaders, they can be effective as leaders, not effective as the last person who was the great leaser or the last person who was great at reducing delinquency, but really a great leader driving the behaviors, working on that anatomy of a motivated employee. And so once we start to put all of these things in place, how do we know if it's working? Well, we have to measure what matters. So a lot of organizations have not wanted to do surveys necessarily because of COVID, because there has been a lot of uncertainty or volatility in the workplace. But I would say when things are bad, it's the best time to survey people. Getting feedback from employees is not about earning a good mark on your business report card. That's your Great Places to Work survey. It's a very different process and it's a very different mindset. So if you're going to gather feedback from employees, you have to be committed to being a change agent based on that feedback. But it's a very important way of connecting to the front line, understanding what their needs are, and then creating an action plan around what it is that you hear. So we definitely encourage organizations to be doing surveys, collecting that feedback. Once a year, in my opinion, is not enough because a lot can happen in a year. And so you can survey, collect feedback during a year, and then set an action plan and pulse around the things that you have action planned to see if the strategies that you've put in place to move the needle on that engagement is working. So that brings us to the end, and I want to open it up. We've got about 10 minutes. Open it up for questions if anybody has any.
Great. Now is the time ask away while you have Kristen's time.
So the question is, do you have an employee survey that we can share? So we do have some collateral. I don't have it handy to pull it up on the screen, but if you wanted to send if you wanted to send an email to me, I can certainly give you that overview. So it doesn't have the questions because that's proprietary, but it would give you an overview categorically of the questions that we ask. Any other questions?
And Kristen is going to share her contact information at the very end so that you can contact her should you need to.
Yep. Yeah, so if you'd like more information on our employee engagement survey product, you are welcome to get in contact with me, or if you already have a rep at Grace Hill or at Kingsley, they can certainly provide some information to you to supplement whatever other suite of products you are currently using with us.
A couple more questions coming in, Kristen.
Mm-hmm. Let's see here. Oh, can you do, I can't see the questions.
Yeah, I'll tell you. So Sandra would like to know, what types of benefits or flexible work options are you seeing companies offer to candidates to attract them to your company?
So it's all over the board. I mean, we're seeing, I think organizations are still trying to find their way. I'm actually not seeing a lot of companies yet increase those frontline wages and as a trade-off for workplace flexibility. But I'm seeing a lot of people offering sign-on bonuses, but I think in order to attract the generation of people who are not in the workforce and have exited is really working on that value proposition, making sure that the company culture is inclusive, that you're welcoming diversity, and that those frontline positions are really valued. I would also encourage, so there's a lot of things in property management that have been the same for a very long time. I'm a firm believer that there is opportunity to create flexibility even in frontline positions. I don't believe that people who are on site necessarily need to be physically there all the time. And so there's a huge demand for business intelligence to understand exactly when things are happening, what times of day, and what days of the week, so that you know exactly when you need to have humans on site doing human things. There's other things that happen in a day-to-day operation that you actually don't need to be physically there for. So I would encourage you to do some research to see what opportunities you may have to build some automation and to build some flexibility into roles that have never had those things. And I do believe those opportunities exist. I think we had a couple other questions.
We did. Let's see. Donna wants to know, how do you compete against other employers that can offer a higher salary or better benefits?
Well, that can be tough. I think, again, company culture is going to be very important, but you really need to have, your employees really need to be ambassadors of your brand. And so it can't just be words that you're putting out there. So the voice of your customer is really the voice of your employees. So I would encourage you to leverage your employees as your external voice, But the reality is that, you know, from a compensation standpoint, there's going to have to be a leveling out of wages. I mean, there may be some outliers that are willing to pay people X amount more than other organizations, but if it's a terrible place to work, they're not going to, all the money in the world is not going to keep people. So, you know, I would really focus on internal mobility and the things that people, things like well-being, things like inclusion. So, you know, compensation is not, at least to our millennial and Gen Z generations, compensation is not the primary driver. So some of those other things are definitely more important. And benefits can be mental health. It doesn't have to necessarily be your traditional benefits. So, you know, you can look into how your current employees are using or not using the benefits that you already offer. You might find some opportunities there.
Let's see, Allie would like to know any book recommendations on change management.
Ooh, off the top of my head, I do not have book recommendations on change management. I will have to look into that. I am someone who loves to listen to lectures on YouTube, and so usually that's where I go to be inspired.
We have just about 2 more minutes here. Lots of questions coming through, which is great, Kristen. They want to pick your brain. You know, we got a question from Heather who said, great presentation, Kristen. How frequently do you recommend stay interviews, and how do you determine who gets a stay interview?
I think stay interviews, that should be a regular, I think there should be some sort of communication loop between managers and employees in both individual and team environments on a quarterly basis when it comes to, so quarterly check-ins. I'm actually not even a big fan of annual reviews. I really like the frequent check-ins. I really like the daily team huddles and the weekly team meetings and the quarterly check-ins with very clear expectations. I'm not someone who's a big believer of the needs improvement rubric. I like to talk to people in a way that's motivating, so that needs improvement is making progress toward the goal instead of needs improvement. So there's always a conversation happening that is very outcome oriented, gives people autonomy over the things that they're responsible for, and then builds in some recognition or celebration of small milestones versus annual milestones.
Great stuff. Let's see, Andrew, do you have any incentive ideas you can think of that will keep employees happy and want to stay? I think you've kind of covered this a little bit. He says, for example, we rolled out a perfect attendance incentive and added an extra $4 to the hourly rate for the pay period, as long as the employee was on time and at work on their scheduled days.
Well, I guess my question would be, did you see a change in behavior after giving that incentive? You know, incentivizing people is tricky because you really want to incentivize people for the behaviors that you want to see, but it's important now to really understand what motivates people. And the only way to do that is through surveys or focus groups. Oh, okay. So then that worked. Yeah. Yes. So yeah, that goes back to the compensation piece, right? So what you did is you essentially paid a premium to get people to come in, and that's kind of what I'm talking about in terms of that's a trade-off for flexibility. But I would also engage your employees in some conversation about work redundancies, about opportunities for automation, about how much time they're spending in what I'm calling non-productive socialization with residents or with tenants. Because if they're physically there in the office, people are going to come talk to them. Does that need to happen? Is that the highest and best use of their time? So getting employees involved in the conversation around change management is an excellent way to engage people.
Well, great. Well, we are right at our time at 3:01. Kristen, I cannot thank you enough. The comments are coming in like crazy to just say how informative this was. It was fantastic. Great information. Can't wait to share with my team. I mean, the comments are just flooding in. So thank you. Thank you so much. For those who missed it or want to recap this, of course, we will share this with you all in email in the days to come this week. And we encourage you to share it with your colleagues and others that you know in the industry that could find this helpful. Kristen's information is right there up on the screen, her email address and phone number. Please reach out if you have any questions at all for her. I'm sure she would be happy to assist you. And Kristen, just thank you so much for being a part of Grace Hill's webinar today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the great engagement and all the great questions. If I didn't get to your question, feel free to email me or connect with me on LinkedIn.
Thank you so much. And to everyone, I hope you have a fantastic day.
Thank you.